John looked worriedly as Lucky, their gentle German shepherd, stood guard beside the crib of their 5-month-old baby girl when the night fell in their humble home. This scene had become a nightly routine for the past 2 weeks. Lucky's ears were up, its body tense, and a deep growl rumbled from its throat. It seemed as though the dog was warning of something no one could understand. John and Sarah could not shake off the increasing sense of anxiety within them. They exchanged doubtful glances, with thoughts of Lucky's unusual behavior swirling in their minds. The dog they had raised for almost 8 years was now the source of their unease every night. Unable to bear it any longer, they decided to secretly watch Lucky at midnight to see if there was something they hadn't noticed. When the clock struck midnight, the house was plunged into a quiet darkness. Only the steady breathing of baby Charlie, sleeping soundly in the crib, could be heard. John and Sarah held their breath, gently tiptoeing through the pitch-black hallway toward the bedroom where Lucky stood guard. They peered through the crack in the door, their eyes fixed on the dog. In an instant, Lucky suddenly stood up, its eyes darting around the room in confusion, as if sensing something unusual. It began to pace around the room, its heavy footsteps echoing in the silent night. Then it stopped, pressing its ear to the wall as if listening to a faint sound, a tremor that only it could feel. Lucky's deep growl rumbled from its throat, filling the air with heavy, eerie tension. John and Sarah looked at each other, holding their breath. They felt a deep, indescribable worry. Then, in a fleeting moment, Lucky abruptly turned its nose toward the baby's mosquito net. It stood still, sniffing, eyes widening, as if focused on something specific. Both of them froze in terror. A chill ran through their hearts, as though Lucky had sensed something that they could not comprehend. They clasped hands tightly, fear creeping into their minds. What was happening with Lucky? Was there something dangerous lurking in their home? Something only this loyal dog could sense? The question gnawed at them, leaving them with no answers. "What's going on?" John whispered, his worried gaze peering through the crack at Charlie's room where Lucky was standing guard. Sarah stood beside him, her hand clenched tightly, unable to hide her concern. "I don't understand either. Lucky has never been like this. He's always been a gentle dog, so fond of Charlie." John stared at Lucky, their dog, who stood silently, ears erect and eyes wide. "That's right. He's always been close to Charlie. Ever since she came home, he's never left her crib. I remember in the early days, Lucky would lie beside the crib every time Charlie slept, his tail wagging lightly whenever he heard a sound from her. But now he seems different." Sarah frowned, anxious. "I've noticed his strange behavior lately. Every night, he stands by the crib as if guarding something, growling nonstop. Do you think he senses something dangerous?" John took a deep breath, not taking his eyes off Lucky. "I don't know, but I can't help but worry. He's not the type of dog to growl without reason, especially not at us. Maybe we need to investigate more." Sarah nodded, gently placing her hand on John's. "You're right. We need to keep watching and see what's going on. Lucky has always been a trustworthy protector in the family, but now I feel like something's not right." Sarah looked at John, her face full of concern, but neither of them knew what to do. They knew Lucky had a protective instinct, but his behavior seemed too intense, and they couldn't understand why. Could he be sensing something that they couldn't see? Meanwhile, Lucky stood guard like a brave soldier, continuing to growl in the darkness, causing the room to feel far from peaceful. The long nights passed, and each morning when they woke up, John and Sarah still couldn't explain the strange change in their reliable dog's behavior. John and Sarah couldn't help but worry about Lucky's unusual actions. They began to wonder if there was a health issue they hadn't noticed, maybe a neurological disorder or a change in his behavior. Negative thoughts constantly invaded their minds. They wondered if Lucky could become dangerous to Charlie, their beloved 5-month-old daughter. They came up with all sorts of theories in their minds, dark thoughts they didn't want to admit. They considered the possibility that Lucky could have a neurological problem, maybe due to an accident or injury in the past that they were unaware of. Could the dog be under so much stress that he couldn't control his behavior? Were his growls a sign of anxiety or a sense of threat that he couldn't handle? These questions repeated in their minds, making them feel uneasy. The next day, John and Sarah decided to call the vet to check on Lucky. When the vet, Dr. Evans, entered the living room, Lucky was still lying quietly on the floor, but his eyes were still scanning the room with caution. "Hello, doctor," John spoke up, his eyes filled with concern. "We're really worried about Lucky. He's been acting very strange lately, always standing guard beside Charlie's crib and growling all night. We don't know if he's sick." Dr. Evans smiled, petting Lucky's head. "We'll give him a thorough check. I'll start with a physical examination to make sure there's no health issue. Dogs can sometimes show strange behavior when they're stressed or when they sense changes in their environment." The vet began examining Lucky's body, listening to his breathing, checking his heart and muscles. After a while, the vet stood up and said, "I don't see anything unusual. Lucky is healthy, and there's no sign of pain or illness. However, his behavior could be a result of stress or changes in his living environment." John looked at the vet with disappointment. "So, there's nothing wrong? But how do we explain the change in his behavior?" Dr. Evans gently explained, "Sometimes dogs can react to changes in the family, like when a new baby is born. They may feel the need to protect, or they may feel uncertain about what's happening. Lucky might be feeling anxious about the changes in the family and wanting to protect little Charlie. At this moment, Lucky sat beside them, his ears drooping, his eyes full of sadness and exhaustion, as if struggling with thoughts he couldn't express. Though he couldn't understand human words, the dog could clearly sense the change in the atmosphere around him. The suspicious glances from John and Sarah made Lucky feel as if an important part of the family had been pushed away, even though all he ever wanted was to protect and care for them. Lucky's growl, which had always been a way for him to express worry and vigilance, now seemed to be misunderstood. He looked up at his owners, his eyes brimming with tears, as if trying to convey that he never meant to cause any fear. It was just that his protective instincts had overwhelmed him, and he only wanted to ensure the safety of the family. But now, every glance from John and Sarah felt like a dagger to his heart. Whenever he, silently, stood guard beside baby Charlie's crib, he didn't feel pride in his role. Instead, he felt a heavy burden in his heart. The soft stirrings of little Charlie in the crib, the gentle breaths of the baby, these were signs Lucky couldn't ignore. It was his responsibility, his duty as a loyal companion. But why now did this protection make everyone push him away? Lucky couldn't understand why his attention, his growls, and his protective actions had become a source of doubt for the family he loved. He was just a dog, an animal with a pure heart, but now he felt betrayed by the very people he had dedicated his life to protecting. In that moment, when Lucky's tear-filled eyes looked at John and Sarah, he felt a deep loneliness. How could he explain that every step he took, every growl he made, came from worry and an endless love for this family? In Lucky's heart, there was only one desire: to prove that he was a loyal friend, not a threat. When he no longer felt loved or trusted, Lucky decided to leave the home he had lived in for so many years. He could not bear the looks of suspicion and rejection from John and Sarah. With weary legs and a heart full of disappointment, Lucky stepped out into the cold winter night. Everything in his mind seemed to spin, unable to understand why the family he loved had pushed him so far away. The darkness of the cold night surrounded him, and the biting winds only deepened the emptiness in his heart. The dog wandered aimlessly, unsure of where to go or where to return, only knowing that there was no longer a place to come back to. There was no more warm food, no more loving hands to pet him. Hungry, cold, and with no one to protect him, Lucky began to feel the loneliness more keenly than ever. His body and spirit were exhausted, but he could not go back, could not face the doubt and disappointment his owners had for him. During the days he wandered, Lucky faced many challenges. He was captured by strangers, dragged away like a worthless animal. Other stray dogs attacked, fighting over territory and food, leaving Lucky with no strength to defend himself. Once, while trying to protect himself from an aggressive dog, Lucky was bitten, breaking his leg. At that moment, in excruciating pain, Lucky had no strength left to stand. He collapsed in a quiet corner of the road, his breath weakening, cold and trembling under the heavy snowstorm. The dog, Lucky, was burning with a fever, his body so weak that it seemed like he wouldn't survive. For the first time in his life, Lucky felt the deepest loneliness, the kind that seemed almost hopeless. There was no one by his side, no one to care for him. In his nearly despairing moments, Lucky could only tilt his head towards the sky, groaning in pain as cold waves of wind battered his body. After a long while, when it seemed as though his body was ready to give up, a glimmer of strength deep within his soul kept him hanging on. Day by day, Lucky lay motionless, as though devoid of life. But somewhere, deep inside, a faint spark of hope began to rekindle. The pain subsided for a moment, and little by little, life returned to his tired body, as he realized he couldn't give up just yet. In his delirium, Lucky recalled the beautiful moments back home, beside the family he loved. These memories, like fragile beams of light, urged him to keep fighting, not to let himself fall. After a long period of suffering, Lucky started to move slowly. His legs hurt, but he refused to quit. The days of wandering seemed to have made him stronger. Though his body was thin and his fur matted, in his eyes still shone a glimmer of hope. One day, someone would find him. Someone would understand, and they would bring him home. Meanwhile, after Lucky had disappeared, John and Sarah scoured the house and the surrounding area, calling out his name in hopes of hearing his familiar bark. But the more they searched, the more they couldn't find him, and the worry in their hearts slowly turned into regret. "Do you think he's lost?" Sarah said with a voice full of concern. "Or worse, could he have been hit by a car?" John remained silent, his hand gripping the doorknob tightly. A wave of guilt washed over him as if he were blaming himself for not trusting Lucky, the dog they had raised and loved for the past 8 years. I should have understood him better, John sighed, his eyes filled with remorse. We were too quick to judge Sarah. A sense of worry and regret filled them both. They wondered if their own doubts and lack of trust had driven Lucky away. The cold looks and harsh words they had directed at him might have made Lucky feel betrayed. It was they, the people Lucky had spent his life protecting, who had caused him to leave. One afternoon, as John and Sarah sat in the living room discussing Lucky's disappearance, the phone rang. It was a call from the building inspector, who had previously been invited to inspect the house due to concerns about moisture in the walls. The inspector said, "I found the cause of the problem. During the inspection, I discovered high moisture levels in the walls, along with visible cracks caused by water leakage. This is serious." John and Sarah listened in shock, but the inspector continued. "Water is seeping into the walls from a crack in the drainage system. If this problem isn't addressed soon, it could cause severe structural damage to the house." Suddenly, an idea flashed in John's mind. He turned to Sarah and exclaimed, "Lucky's growl. It must have been because he heard water running in the walls. Every night, Lucky stood guard by Charlie's crib, not because he felt there was danger, but because he heard the sound of water running, a sound we couldn't hear." Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at her husband, a deep sense of regret flooding her heart. She remembered the nights when Lucky stood watch by Charlie's crib, growling gently but never showing any aggression. Those growls, those protective actions from Lucky, were warnings they had overlooked. Lucky wasn't a threat. He was just worried about their family. John, too, felt a lump in his throat and couldn't speak. He sighed, clenching his fists. "We were wrong, Sarah. We pushed Lucky away. He just wanted to help us." Sarah lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. "And we thought he was a threat. We hurt him. And now he's gone?" After the call ended, they immediately took action. John and Sarah invited a team of repairmen to fix the cracks in the walls and the damaged drainage system. But in their hearts, the worry about Lucky never stopped. Every day, they hoped they would find him, hoping that he would come back and forgive them. 2 months later, the house had been fully repaired. The cracks in the walls were fixed, and the damaged drainage system had been completely restored. John and Sarah felt more at ease than ever before, but in their hearts there was still a lingering worry about Lucky, the dog they had hurt, wondering if he would ever come back and if everything could truly be balanced again. That day, a spring morning with the first rays of sunlight shining through the window, John sat at the breakfast table with Sarah. They were sharing a simple meal, but their minds were both focused on Lucky. They had spoken many times about the dog, about the days he had spent with the family. Although Lucky had returned, they knew it would take time for everything to feel normal again. "I don't think Lucky will ever forget what happened," Sarah said softly, her eyes carrying a hint of sadness. John nodded. "You're right, but we have to do everything we can to show him that we truly love him and trust him." Just then, John's phone rang, interrupting their thoughts. He quickly picked it up, and when he saw the unfamiliar number on the screen, its heart began to race, feeling as though something important was about to happen. He pressed the button to answer and heard a man's voice on the other end. "Hello, I'm from the abandoned neighborhood nearby. I found your dog, Lucky. He's here, and he seems very tired," the man said, his voice deep and somber. John and Sarah exchanged a glance, their eyes lighting up with hope, but also filled with worry. "That's Lucky. Can you keep him there?" "We'll come right away," Sarah said urgently, her voice trembling with emotion. The call ended, and no one spoke for a moment. Both of them quickly stood up, hurrying to prepare to leave. They couldn't wait for another second. They knew that Lucky had endured so much over the past months, and now was the time for their family to reunite, to make up for all the pain the dog had gone through. When they arrived at the abandoned neighborhood, the sight before them was heart-wrenching. Lucky was lying by an old wall, his body thin and his eyes filled with sadness. Hearing the car, Lucky lifted his head, and his gaze immediately met John and Sarah's. In a few short moments, Lucky recognized them. He stood up and wobbled toward them with a weak, unsteady walk, but his loyalty and love were still strong in every step. John knelt down, reached out his hand, and softly called Lucky, "Come home, my dog." Lucky came close, rubbing against John's leg, then turned to Sarah, licking her hand gently. A moment of silence passed, but it was a priceless moment when everything seemed to be healed. Sarah embraced Lucky, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "We're sorry, Lucky. We're sorry for doubting you." John gently stroked Lucky's head. "From now on, we'll always trust you, always love you, no matter what happens." Lucky stood there, his eyes shining with joy, his tail wagging vigorously. The dog didn't need words, just a wag of his tail and an excited woof. Now all the sadness and loneliness seemed to have passed, and Lucky was back with his family. That very day, a special memory was created. It was the day John's family had adopted Lucky 8 years ago. They recalled the moment when they first saw him at the shelter, and now Lucky was standing at the door of their home as an irreplaceable part of their family. "We've been through so much together, Lucky," Sarah said, petting the dog's head, "and we'll always be together." And then, as promised, the family gathered together, feeling the bond and love that would never fade. Lucky, the loyal dog, had returned, not only to protect this family, but also to prove that love and loyalty can overcome any challenge. The long road home no longer seemed distant, and though there had been sorrow in the past, from now on, John and Sarah's family would always know that love, trust, and loyalty could never be replaced. Together, they would face every challenge, and Lucky, the beloved German Shepherd, would always be an irreplaceable part of their lives. The story of Lucky and the Johnson family concluded, not just as a moving journey of loyalty and love, but also as a valuable lesson in trust and misunderstanding within relationships. Sometimes actions meant to show care and protection are misinterpreted, leading to unintended consequences. But through every hardship and challenge, we come to realize that the truth always finds its way out, and love and loyalty will always conquer doubt. This story also reminds us of the importance of listening and understanding, whether with pets, friends, or loved ones. Recognizing and truly understanding the actions and emotions of others is key to building strong and loving relationships. Sometimes, the smallest things can save a family, just as Lucky saved the Johnson family. Ultimately, through this story, we learn that every mistake and every opportunity to try again is a chance to strengthen and rebuild trust and love, what matters most in all relationships.